All right, so now that we have both studied the expenditure output model, aka the Keynesian Cross Model, aka the K-Cross Model, and we've seen how we can use a simultaneously determined model in Excel to make predictions about the state of the economy, we can note some of the shortcomings of this model, specifically that it only allows for two types of deviations from equilibrium, or two types of undesirable equilibriums. So we could either have an equilibrium where the economy is functioning at full capacity, we're stable in terms of prices and growth. We could have a contraction, a recession shortfall, a recessionary gap, or we could have an inflationary gap. However, neither of those outcomes allow for a combination of the two. So they don't allow for deflation and growth or inflation and a recession. And so in this video, we're going to start to think about what other types of shocks the economy could face aside from an inflationary period of expansion and a recessionary period with price stability. So this video is largely going to serve as an introduction to our study of the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, which is going to be our workhorse for understanding how the macroeconomy functions, how different market forces which impact a national economy at large may lead to different combinations of the types of economic indicators which we studied in the previous weeks. So this video is largely intended to serve as a motivation for understanding the need for an alternative model to the Keynesian cross, that as good of a starting point as that is, as helpful as it is to be able to see how we can use a model to think about desirable states of the economy and how there is a need for intervention in the macroeconomy, that Say's law doesn't really hold in the long run, that we've seen that through the Great Depression, the Great Recession, and throughout much of the past 80 years, 80, 90 years, so that we need to think about how we can get the economy out of a long-lasting, undesirable equilibrium. I also think that this video is important going forward in your professional life, that when you make decisions that are dependent on your prediction of the future state of the economy, that you can be aware of the different directions in which the economy can trend, that you're not just imagining, hey, there's three possible worlds. We could either be okay, we could be contracting, or we could be inflationary, that there's other combinations of those outcomes. And that you will then be prepared to think about what improvements would be necessary and what the types of improvements would be necessary to get the economy moving in the direction that we all want it to move. So as stated in the introduction to this video, in the Keynesian Cross Model, we just think of these two types of deviations from our desirable equilibrium, that we may have aggregate expenditure be less than aggregate output and have a recessionary gap. On the other hand, we could have aggregate expenditure be greater than our aggregate output and have an inflationary gap. We could have too much money chasing too few of goods, and that's just going to be our definition of inflation. However, as we've also discussed in the introduction to this video, these are clearly not the only types of outcomes which we could face, and really we may be seeing part of the beginning of that in the response to our recovery from the coronavirus shutdown. So in addition to the two types of deviations from desirable equilibrium that we have in the Keynesian Cross Model, being that of growth and inflation or a recession and deflation, there's also the possibility that we could have a recession and inflation, which is just going to be a double whammy, but unfortunately that's possible, and we've experienced that over the past 50 years in our country as well as experiencing growth and deflation. So we can also think about combinations of these outcomes that are going to be more ambiguous, where We could have a recession and an ambiguous effect on prices or stable prices, or a stable impact on growth, and such as stagnant growth and inflation. So there's more possible combinations here, but these are the four primary directions that we want to think about. And we also want to think about the long run equilibrium and not just the short run equilibrium as well. So to create an improved model, maybe a more realistic model than that of the Keynesian cross, we can think about some of the assumptions which are necessary for the Keynesian cross model to hold. That when we first learned that model, we said we're going to make the following set of assumptions: that we're going to hold constant aggregate supply. We're not going to consider that. We're going to hold constant the financial sector. We're not going to think about what the impacts of financialization in the economy are. And we're going to assume that our behavior with the rest of the world, with the foreign sector, is going to be constant as well. So if we want to think about these other types of outcomes, about how we could predict having inflation and a stagnant economy, then the only assumption here that we need to relax is going to be that of aggregate supply. That if we relax some of these other assumptions, we may be able to make an even more improved model. But in this class, we are just going to further relax this one assumption, that aggregate supply can change in addition to aggregate demand. And so, which in the previous model was aggregate expenditure. So when we relax this assumption, we are going to be able to think of a more rich model that could predict more outcomes. So by considering the aggregate supply in addition to aggregate demand, we can then form a more comprehensive prediction of what will happen to the economy when measured by the three indicators which we're studying in this class, being growth, being unemployment, and being inflation. And doing so is going to give us the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So how does the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, ASAD model, differ from the Keynesian cross model? So we can focus on some of these key differences by looking at the axes and by looking at the curves. That obviously in the Keynesian cross model, we just have that one curve, the aggregate expenditure curve. And in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we have the aggregate demand curve, which is downward sloping. We'll discuss that more in the next video, as well as the upward sloping aggregate supply curve and the potential GDP curve. So we thought about the potential GDP with regard to the Keynesian cross model as well, except for now it's going to be an explicit feature of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So while the two axes on the Keynesian cross model just measured aggregate expenditure and real GDP, the horizontal axis on the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model is actually going to be the same. It's going to measure real GDP, but the vertical axis is no longer aggregate expenditure. It's going to be price level. And so this is where understanding of indexes and base years is going to be important. That this is going to be in reference to an indexed base year where the value of expenditures, value of all prices in the economy is going to be 100. And then we can realize that anything less than that is going to be lower in price. Anything greater than that is going to be higher in aggregate prices throughout the economy. And any movement of the equilibrium downward is going to reflect deflation. Any movement of the equilibrium upward is going to reflect inflation. So in this model, we're also going to assume that input prices are going to be fixed unless stated otherwise, unless there is a change in the input prices as mentioned in a prompt, in a question, or when facing the economy. We're going to assume that potential GDP is attainable by fully utilizing the existing levels of labor, technology, and capital in the economy, and this is going to create the full employment GDP. So remember, there's still going to be some level of unemployment, which is allowed here. It's going to be frictional unemployment when we're searching from one job to a new job, which is valued by the economy. But there's not going to be any cyclical unemployment, that we are not seeing people without a job because of a business cycle. So a great strength of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model when compared to the Keynesian Cross Model is our ability to separate out impacts according to inflation and according to growth. Now, we do make the assumption in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model that growth and unemployment are going to be perfectly correlated. That whenever we're in a period of economic expansion, when we're growing GDP, it's getting larger, unemployment is going to be getting smaller. And that's part of the reasoning behind approaching that vertical potential GDP curve. And part of it is due to the relationship between unemployment and growth. And so to make this point a little bit more clear, to kind of defend that assumption that unemployment and growth are going to move in the same direction, move in opposite directions, but always move at the same time according to the same catalyst, then I want to first discuss the definition of a recession. So we've discussed recession so far in this class when we first thought about the circular flow model of the economy, when we discussed the Great Recession, when we discussed recessionary gaps, but we haven't really given a formal definition of a recession yet. And so the standard definition of a recession is that it is a period of temporary economic decline during which trade and industrial activity are reduced, and this is generally identified by a fall in GDP in 2 consecutive quarters. And so obviously quarters means 4. We have 4 quarters in a single year. And if GDP was to decline in 2 consecutive quarters, then we would officially label that a recession. However, that's not going to be the only way in which we can identify a recession. And so you might see where this is going. We can use unemployment as a way to identify recessions as well. So the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model is going to assume that when we have growth, we have decreasing unemployment. However, I also think that in response to our recovery from the coronavirus impact on the economy, that we are seeing the need to have a better workhorse or standard model of the economy than the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, due to the K-shaped recovery which we're having, right? So growth in real GDP may actually be increasing while simultaneously carrying a large amount of perhaps long-lasting unemployment. And so this is just one example of divergent economies within our single macroeconomy in the U.S. that we've had increasing levels of economic and wealth inequality for a long period of time, but now we may have more static inequality or divergent outcomes at any particular point in time. However, part of the reasoning, or I guess part of the link between growth and unemployment, or recessions and unemployment, is that we often see higher levels of unemployment when the economy is about to enter a recession. And so a couple years ago, I guess maybe more than 10 years ago at this point, or about 10 years ago, the Federal Reserve Bank officially added the SOM rule for predicting recessions. And so some of you may actually be following Claudia Somm on Twitter for this class. Claudia Somm is an economist, got her PhD from University of Michigan, actually got her bachelor's in economics from my alma mater at Denison University, and has really made a name for herself as not only being a stellar economist, but also a voice for gender equality in the field of economics. And so this rule, which is named after, was a way to predict recessions and actually led to quicker identification of when the economy was in a recession or would wind up in a recession. And this rule was based on using the 3-month moving average of the national unemployment rate rising by 0.5 percentage point or more relative to its low during the previous 12 months. And so this is actually done pretty well over the previous several years in predicting periods of recessions. And so in this image from the Federal Reserve Bank, you can see the SOM rule over time, over the past 65, 70 years, and its ability to predict recession. So to make this a little bit more clear, both the blue and the red line are the SOM rules, the SOM indicator, SOM rule recession indicator, and the different colors just represent whether it was tracked in real time or not. And when that line crosses this orange dashed line, which is down here at 0.5, then it's going to trigger it's going to indicate that we are entering a recession. And so you can see that basically anytime we do that, so here and here and here, we're catching the recession a lot earlier than we would be if we were waiting for the peak to occur, for example. That's happening basically once we're out of the recession. And so this is allowing us to catch recessions a little bit earlier on, which could be important for federal policy decisions, especially if we are going to index or create automatic policies, which would kick in whenever we're in a recession. We'll talk about that more when we discuss fiscal policy. And just to say one last thing about Claudia Sahm in this class, she made some waves in the summer of 2020 by sending a letter to some of the gatekeepers of the profession of economics. And so these included people who held high-level rankings at the National Association of Economists in the U.S., and I guess the world really for that matter, as well as who included two former chair people of the Federal Reserve Bank, the chairman of the Federal Reserve during the Great Recession being Ben Bernanke, as well as his successor, Janet Yellen, who at that point in time was one of the most powerful people in the world, who's now been replaced by Jerome Powell. But both of Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke carry a lot of weight in the field, and Claudia Sahm's letter to them, which was eventually published on her blog and recirculated on other news outlets, was that economics is a disgrace due to sexual harassment, tormenting of young female minority ethnic economists, in the way that was kind of swept under the rug for a long period of time in economics, and still to this day by many accounts. So if you have any interest in learning more about this, by all means, if you Google Claudia Sahm or Google economics is a disgrace, you can find her open letter. And I'd encourage you to read it as a way of understanding some of the challenges which are present in the field, but also some of the efforts to bring them more to light and use sunlight as a disinfectant to make us more aware of these concerns so that we may become a more inclusive field going forward. So I think it's valuable work, and yeah, I'm glad to share an alma mater and all of us to share liberal arts education with somebody who's making this type of priority.